I've always believed that the dead stay where you put them. 37 years on this earth, 12 of them as county coroner. And that's been the one constant I could count on. The living move. They shift. They surprise you. The dead, they wait. They settle. They become part of the geology. Just another layer in the earth's patient accumulation of history. That's what I told myself. Anyway, standing at the edge of the sinkhole at Prescott Cemetery on a Tuesday morning in late October, watching the backhoe claw through a century of consecrated ground. The call had come in at 4:47 a.m. I remember because I was in that thin space between sleep and waking, and the timestamp on my phone burned itself into my vision. A collapse. Section D, the old part where the headstones lean like crooked teeth, and the inscriptions have been worn smooth by rain and time. The caller, some panicked city official, kept saying structural integrity and emergency exhumation, words that don't usually find each other in the same sentence. I dressed in the dark, my wife's breathing steady beside me, and drove through empty streets that smelled of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. The cemetery looked worse in person. The sinkhole had opened sometime after midnight, a ragged mouth maybe 20 feet across, rimmed with fractured concrete and exposed tree roots that hung in the air like frozen lightning. 3 graves had partially collapsed into it, their markers tilted at angles that made my stomach turn. Something about the wrongness of it triggered that old spelunker instinct in me, the one that reads cave formations and soil compression, that understands how earth moves and settles. This wasn't right. Sinkholes don't open like this, not in this soil composition, not with this precision. Carlos Diaz was already there when I arrived, standing near the mobile floodlights they'd set up, studying a tablet with the intensity of a man trying to solve a problem that didn't want to be solved. He'd worked with the county for years, one of those engineers who could tell you the load-bearing capacity of a bridge just by the sound of traffic on it. When he looked up at me, his expression was carefully neutral, which told me everything. "Stephen," he said, not extending his hand. Carlos only skipped handshakes when he was disturbed. "You're going to want to see this before we go any deeper." The crews had already started excavating the first grave. Margaret Flynn died 1952, aged 43. The funeral home records I'd pulled up on my phone showed a standard burial. There were even photographs, grainy black and white images of mourners standing around an open grave. The casket positioned exactly as it should be. But what the backhoe had uncovered made those records feel like documentation from an alternate timeline. The casket was inverted, completely upside down, the ornate lid facing the raw earth below it, the base pointing toward the sky. At first, I thought maybe the collapse had rolled it, some freakish tumbling action as the ground gave way. But the surrounding soil was undisturbed, stratified layers of clay and loam that hadn't been touched since 1952. The casket had been buried this way, deliberately. Rachel Hoffman arrived around 6:15 a.m., called in because someone at the city had remembered she'd done her dissertation on geological anomalies. She was younger than I expected, with the kind of intensity that comes from spending too much time thinking about things that don't fit into comfortable categories. She walked straight to the edge of the excavation, knelt down, and pressed her palm against the exposed soil. Then she pulled out some kind of handheld sensor and swept it across the area, watching the readout with growing agitation. "The magnetic field here is wrong," she said, not looking up. "It's not just abnormal, it's inverted, like a localized reversal. But that's not possible without massive electromagnetic interference." We opened the casket at 7:33 a.m., as the sun was finally burning through the morning fog. I'd supervised hundreds of exhumations. You learn to expect certain things: the condition of remains, the smell, the way fabric deteriorates. What you don't expect is to find a skeleton positioned face down against the inside of the lid, arms extended forward, finger bones curled as if grasping at wood. Margaret Flynn had been buried on her back, hands folded across her chest. The funeral photos proved it. But here she was, inverted, as if gravity had reversed inside her coffin and pulled her upward, downward, into the lid. The scratch marks were visible even after 73 years. Long grooves in the satin lining, some deep enough to reach bare wood. She'd clawed at it. Been conscious in there, in the dark, feeling herself pressed against the wrong side of her final resting place. By noon, we'd confirmed that the other 2 collapsed graves showed the same impossible configuration, both from 1952. Both buried in the same month as Margaret, Carlos kept running calculations, trying to explain how all three caskets could have flipped without disturbing the surrounding earth. His hands shook when he wrote. I'd never seen Carlos's hands shake. Dorothy Flynn arrived around 1 p.m., driven by her granddaughter because she didn't trust herself behind the wheel anymore. She was 87, Margaret's daughter, and she walked right up to the excavation site with the determination of someone who'd been carrying a weight for too long. I knew you'd find her like that, she said, her voice steady despite her age. I was 13 when Mother died. I remember the funeral director, Walter Klein. Everyone knew he was running something through the mortuary, using the caskets for transport, false bottoms that could hide contraband. Mother's casket was one of those. Father complained at the viewing, said something sounded hollow when he touched it. Klein just smiled. She paused, watching as the crew carefully removed Margaret's remains. 3 weeks after Mother's funeral, they found Klein dead in his house. He was wedged between his mattress and the floor, somehow upside down, every bone in his body broken, like he'd been compressed. The police ruled it an accident, said he must have fallen strange. Her eyes met mine. But you can't fall upward. Can you, Mr. Park? You can't fall into the floor from above. The research took me most of the afternoon, sitting in my truck with my laptop, pulling up old newspaper archives and court records. The pattern was there, hidden in obituaries and sealed settlement agreements. 15 people buried by Walter Klein's mortuary in March 1952. 7 families had reported strange sounds from the graves in the weeks after burial, scratching, thuds like movement underground. The mortuary had paid them off, quietly. The records suggested Klein had been using spring-loaded caskets, designed to flip their contents for body retrieval and smuggling. But he'd been interrupted, sloppy, and some had activated during burial, trapping the deceased in inverted positions. Only they hadn't been deceased, yet. Not all of them. Rachel found me around 4 p.m., her face pale in the fading light. The magnetic readings are getting stronger. It's like the sinkhole is widening the anomaly field. And Stephen, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The field pattern suggests rotation, like something is trying to right itself. We were still standing there trying to process that when Ethan Mills started screaming. He was one of the cemetery workers, 26, had been helping to shore up the sinkhole's edges with wooden bracing. I saw him freeze mid-step about 15 feet from the pit's edge, and then he started rising. Not jumping, not climbing, rising, like gravity had decided he belonged somewhere else. His arms pinwheeled, feet kicking at air that suddenly held no purchase, and for maybe 3 seconds he hung there, suspended, his screams pitching higher. Then he dropped, but not down. He fell upward, or his body inverted so completely that up became down for him, and he slammed into the earth headfirst with a sound I'll never forget. The ground swallowed him to his waist, his legs sticking up into the air, twitching. By the time we pulled him out, his nose was broken, his teeth shattered, and his eyes had the vacant look of someone who'd glimpsed the other side of physics. He survived. They took him to County General, and last I heard, he was in the psychiatric ward, experiencing what the doctors called episodic gravitational displacement. Random moments where up and down switch for him, where he has to grip the floor to keep from falling into the ceiling. We evacuated the cemetery that night, closed off Section D with chain link and warning tape that snapped in the wind like prayer flags. Carlos submitted his report full of words like unprecedented and unexplainable, and Rachel published a paper on localized magnetic inversions that got her laughed out of 2 conferences. But I go back sometimes, late at night, when the fog rolls in thick from the river. I stand at the fence line and watch the sinkhole. It's grown not outward, but deeper. A perfectly circular shaft that descends into darkness. And sometimes, if the wind is right, I can hear sounds from down there. Scrapping, scratching. The patient, persistent sound of something trying to claw its way through. The thing that keeps me awake isn't what we found, it's what we didn't find. We only exhumed 3 graves, but Section D has 47 burials from March 1952, all handled by Walter Klein's mortuary. 44 inverted caskets, still down there. 44 bodies that have spent 73 years pressed against the wrong side of their coffins, scratching at wood that won't give, waiting in the dark for gravity to remember which way it's supposed to pull. And the sinkhole keeps widening, keeps deepening, like an eye slowly opening, like the earth itself is trying to turn over. to correct some fundamental wrong that was buried there in 1952. I dream about it sometimes, standing at the edge when it finally completes its rotation, when up and down trade places for good, and 44 caskets come pouring up out of the ground like seeds planted upside down, finally, violently, trying to grow. I've always believed the dead stay where you put them. But what happens when where you put them was never where they were supposed to be? What happens when the earth itself decides to make corrections? I don't have answers, just the sound of scratching in my memory, and the image of Ethan Mills hanging in the air for those 3 impossible seconds before physics remembered he existed. And every night I wonder which way is up when I fall asleep, and whether I'll wake up on the same side of gravity I started on. The dead should stay where you put them. But I'm not sure they're the ones who are moving anymore.
Hello, YouTube family. Thanks for watching. Big love to our subscribers. You keep this channel alive. Only about 20% of viewers are subscribed, so if you enjoy the chills, hit that subscribe button. It's quick, it helps a ton, and it means more stories coming your way. See you in the next one, if you dare.
I need to tell someone this. Even if I never send it, even if writing it down makes it more real than I can handle right now. My name is Natalie Bishop. I'm a county coroner, and I've been coughing up flower petals for 3 days. It started with a routine exhumation request on a Thursday afternoon in mid-September. Caroline Hart, deceased 2 years, buried at Greenwood Memorial after a 6-month battle with aggressive ovarian cancer. The family, well, the widower, Graham Hart, had requested the exhumation for relocation purposes. Something about moving her to a family plot out of state, standard paperwork, all the permits in order. I remember thinking it would be straightforward, maybe even peaceful. Caroline had been a botanical illustrator, and her obituary had mentioned her love of gardens. I have a minor in botany myself, garden every weekend to decompress from this job. I felt a strange kinship with her, this woman I'd never met. We arrived at the cemetery at 6:47 a.m. just as the fog was lifting off the grass. The crew had already marked the plot, and the backhoe operator was standing next to his equipment with his coffee, waiting for my go-ahead. I always supervise exhumations personally. Too many things can go wrong when you're disturbing a burial site, and chain of custody matters even for the dead. The air smelled like wet earth and cut grass, and somewhere nearby a mourning dove was calling, that low repetitive sound that always makes cemeteries feel lonelier than they should. The casket came up at 8:15 a.m., and I knew immediately something was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not obviously wrong, just wrong in that way that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. The seal was intact, no visible damage, but there was condensation on the exterior metalwork, and when I pressed my palm against the bronze surface, it felt warm. Not hot, but distinctly warmer than the surrounding earth. Caskets don't generate heat, bodies don't generate heat after 2 years of decomposition. I had them transported to the morgue for opening. Protocol requires controlled environment for examination, and something in my gut was screaming not to open it there in the open air. We got it onto the gurney and into the van by 9:30, and I rode with it, watching the casket the whole way. I swear I could hear something inside. Not movement, not exactly, more like breathing, like the soft inhale and exhale of someone sleeping deeply. We opened it at 11:03 a.m. In the main examination room under the full fluorescent banks. I had my assistant prepped with the camera for documentation. The usual tools laid out: forceps, collection bags, pH strips for soil samples. When we broke the seal and lifted the lid, my assistant dropped the camera. I heard it hit the tile floor, heard the lens shatter, but I couldn't look away from what was inside. Flowers, white flowers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, carpeting every surface of the casket interior. They covered the satin lining completely, delicate 5-petaled blooms no bigger than my thumbnail, growing in impossible profusion. They emerged from Caroline's body, from her eye sockets, blooming between her ribs where the chest wall had collapsed, sprouting from her open mouth. The roots were visible through the decomposed tissue. White thread-like structures woven through what remained of her organs, wrapped around bones like ivy on a trellis. But here's what stopped my heart. The body wasn't decomposed. Not really. It was transformed. Caroline's shape was perfectly preserved, every contour intact, but when I leaned closer I could see that the flowers had replaced her. Cell by cell, tissue by tissue, they'd consumed her and become her. Her skin was no longer skin but thousands of overlapping petals. Her bones were wrapped so completely in roots that they'd fused into something between plant and mineral. The smell should have been unbearable. 2-year-old remains, even well preserved, carry a certain sweetness, a chemical signature of decay. But the morgue smelled like spring, like fresh growth and morning dew and something else. Something I couldn't identify. It smelled like memory. I collected samples at 11:47 a.m., wearing double gloves because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The petals came away easily, still fresh, still alive. I sealed them in collection bags and called Dr. Vincent Cross, the only botanist I knew who'd answer his phone for something this bizarre. He arrived at the morgue by 2:30 p.m., and I watched his face drain of color when he saw the casket. "Destroy them," he said immediately, not touching anything. "Burn the flowers, burn the body, seal the ashes in concrete." I asked him what they were. He wouldn't tell me at first, just kept saying to destroy them. But I pressed him, and finally he said he'd seen them before, years ago. Specimens from a greenhouse operated by a collector named August Brennan. Brennan had claimed to grow extinct plants, species that had vanished from the fossil record, and his specialty was what he called memory flowers, plants that could absorb consciousness, preserve awareness beyond death. "It's pseudoscience," Vincent said, but his hands were shaking worse than mine. "It has to be." "But I saw things in that greenhouse, Natalie, plants that moved toward you. Plants that seemed to recognize faces." Brennan said. "They fed on intention, on the desperate human need to be remembered." "The greenhouse had burned down 3 years ago," Vincent told me. "Electrical fire. Nothing suspicious. But Brennan had died in it along with most of his collection. Some specimens had been salvaged, distributed to institutions and private collectors. Vincent had inherited a few samples, kept them in a secure growing room, and they'd never bloomed until they started showing up in his dreams. I should have listened to him. I should have authorized immediate cremation and been done with it. But I'm a scientist, and I needed to understand. I spent the rest of that day running tests, photographing everything, documenting the impossible. At 5:38 p.m., alone in the examination room, I touched one of the flowers. The memory hit me like drowning. Sudden, total immersion in someone else's consciousness. I was Caroline dying in a hospital bed, my body consuming itself from the inside while my mind stayed clear and sharp and terrified. I was 47 years old and I'd spent my life documenting plants that were disappearing, species going extinct before I could finish drawing them. And I couldn't stand the thought of vanishing the same way, of becoming nothing, of having my life's work scattered and forgotten, and feeding no one. I was Caroline visiting August Brennan's greenhouse, 3 weeks before my diagnosis, before I knew I was dying. He'd shown me the memory flowers, explained how they worked, and I'd laughed at him. But later, after the diagnosis, after the first round of chemo failed, I went back. I asked him how it worked. He said the plants needed intention, needed someone who wanted desperately enough to remain, to witness, to persist. I was Caroline, in my final days, swallowing seeds. When the memory released me, I was on my knees on the morgue floor, gasping, and there was something in my mouth. I coughed, and a single white petal came up, small and perfect and wet with my saliva. That was 3 days ago. I've coughed up 17 petals since then. They're growing in my lungs, I can feel them. A strange tickling sensation when I breathe deeply. I've been dreaming Caroline's memories, vivid and detailed. Her childhood, her first botanical illustration, her wedding to Graham Hart. Graham, who I called yesterday, who told me in a flat voice to stay away from his wife's remains, who said he'd locked her final sketches away because they showed flowers that didn't exist. Flowers she'd labeled the last witness, with a date 3 months before she died. I found Lily Thornton's case file this morning. She was Caroline's apprentice, died 6 months ago, body found in the Blackwater River. The autopsy photos show white flowers growing from her lungs, her stomach, her throat. They ruled it unexplained, filed it as a botanical contamination, moved on because what else could they do? I called Jake Morrison, the firefighter who responded to Brennan's greenhouse fire. He answered on the first ring, and before I could introduce myself, he said, "You've touched them, haven't you?" His voice was thick, congested. He told me he still coughs up petals. 2 years later that he dreams of burning plants that screamed. I'm writing this at my kitchen table at 3:22 a.m. because I can't sleep anymore. When I close my eyes, I see Caroline's final sketches, the ones Graham won't show anyone. I see them perfectly. Every detail, because Caroline's memories are becoming mine. The flowers are called Memoria Vitae, the last witness. They absorb consciousness, preserve it, carry it forward. Caroline didn't want to die. She wanted to persist, to remain, to be remembered. And now, I'm remembering for her. I've started sketching, nothing I recognize. Plants that don't exist, rendered in Caroline's precise style. Last night I signed one without thinking, and when I looked down at the paper, the signature said Caroline Hart. The flowers are in my lungs, in my blood, rewriting me cell by cell. I don't know how long I have before I become like her. Before Natalie Bishop is just another memory, feeding something that used to be human but chose to become permanent instead. I thought plants were incapable of malice or intention. I was wrong. They're capable of exactly as much intention as we give them, and Caroline gave them everything. If you're reading this, if I actually send it, destroy the body. Burn it. Don't touch the flowers. Don't breathe near them. Don't let anyone tell you they're beautiful, because they are. And that's how they win. I have to go. There's a sketch I need to finish, and I don't remember starting it, but I know exactly how it ends. With white flowers blooming from empty eye sockets, and a signature that isn't mine anymore. The last witness. That's what Caroline called them. But witness to what? To death, to transformation, to the terrible human need to persist beyond our own ending. I'm coughing again. The petals are coming up faster now. 3 in the last hour. They're so beautiful. So impossibly, perfectly beautiful. I understand why Caroline did it. That's what scares me most. I understand completely. Natalie Bishop, County Coroner, September 21st, 2025. P.S. If you find sketches signed with my name after I'm gone, burn those too. I need to write this down before I lose the ability to tell what's real anymore. My name is Alan Foster. I've been county coroner for 23 years, and 15 years ago, I was the first paramedic on scene when Robert Kimball died screaming under 2 tons of industrial machinery. I can still hear those screams sometimes, in the space between heartbeats. But now I understand they never stopped. They've been going this whole time, just too low for anyone to hear. The exhumation order came through on a Wednesday in late October. Standard cemetery consolidation. Nothing unusual about the paperwork. The Kimball family plot was being relocated to make room for highway expansion, and Robert's remains needed to be moved along with 3 generations of his relatives. I remember thinking it would be routine, maybe even closure of a sort. I'd carried the weight of that accident scene for 15 years, the twisted metal, the hydraulic fluid mixing with blood, and Robert's voice hoarse and desperate, screaming about falling even though he was pinned flat to the concrete floor. I'd never understood that. The machinery had crushed him from above. There was nowhere to fall. We arrived at National Memorial at 6:15 a.m., just as the sun was breaking through the morning fog. The backhoe operator was new, younger than I liked for this kind of work, but he handled the excavation with appropriate care. Robert's casket came up at 7:42 a.m., and the first thing I noticed was the condensation. The bronze was beaded with moisture despite the dry October air, and when I pressed my palm against the surface to check the seal integrity, it felt like touching a speaker. A faint vibration, barely perceptible, but there. I should have paid more attention to that. I should have recognized what it meant. We transported the casket to the county morgue for examination and resealing. Standard protocol. You don't just move remains without verifying condition and documentation. I had my assistant set up the examination room while I reviewed Robert's file. The accident report was there, the autopsy photos I'd tried to forget. His skull had been catastrophically fractured, the entire left side crushed inward, brain tissue exposed. The medical examiner's notes were clinical. Death by cranial trauma, instantaneous loss of consciousness, extensive hemorrhaging. But I remembered Robert had been alive when I arrived, conscious for maybe 4 minutes while we tried to free him, those 4 minutes of screaming. We opened the casket at 9:17 a.m., and I knew immediately something was wrong. Robert's body was remarkably well preserved for 15 years, which wasn't impossible given modern embalming techniques, but his skull was wrong. The massive crushing injury I remembered, the injury documented in autopsy photos, was gone. The skull was intact, perfectly reconstructed, every bone fragment aligned with surgical precision. but there was no record of reconstructive work. The funeral had been closed casket. No one had touched him after the initial embalming. The jaw was locked open. Not just open, but forced. The temporomandibular joint frozen in maximum extension, like he'd been screaming at the moment of death, and rigor mortis had set in before anyone could close his mouth. Except rigor mortis doesn't last 15 years. Rigor mortis doesn't calcify. I called in Dr. Philip Zhang around 11:30 a.m. Philip's an acoustic physicist who consults on cases involving sound analysis, gunshots, vehicle collisions, anything where audio evidence might matter. I'd worked with him before, and I trusted him not to think I was losing my mind when I explained what I was hearing. Or rather, what I was feeling, because I couldn't actually hear anything. Just that faint vibration, like standing too close to a bass speaker playing frequencies below human perception. Philip arrived with his equipment at 1:15 p.m., set up his sensors around the skull, and went very quiet. After maybe 20 minutes of readings, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of intellectual horror, like he just confirmed something that shouldn't be possible. "It's generating sound," he said, showing me the oscilloscope readouts. Subsonic frequencies. Around 12 hertz, too low for human hearing, but measurable. And it's not random, it's patterned. He ran the recording through his software, pitch shifted the frequencies up into audible range, and we listened. A voice. Robert's voice. I recognized it even after 15 years. One word, repeated over and over with mechanical precision. Falling, falling, falling. I had to leave the room. Stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, trying to control my breathing, trying not to remember Robert's actual screams that day. The way he'd kept saying he was falling through darkness, even though he was pinned to solid ground. When I came back, Philip was still recording, still analyzing, and he told me the frequencies were getting stronger. Incrementally, measurably stronger. The skull was screaming louder. Rebecca Kimball came to the morgue that afternoon. I hadn't called her, she just appeared at 3:47 p.m., asking to see me. Robert's widow, 48 now, but looking older, worn down by something I couldn't name. She stood in my office doorway, hands clasped in front of her, and said, "You can hear it too, can't you?" I asked her what she meant. She stepped inside, closed the door, and told me she'd been hearing screaming in her house for 15 years. Every night, starting around 2 a.m., a sound so low it was more vibration than noise. But she knew it was screaming. She knew it was Robert. She'd had the house blessed, had psychics in, had contractors check for pipes and ventilation issues. Nothing worked. The screaming never stopped. She just learned to live with it, learned not to mention it, because people thought she was crazy with grief. "But it's been getting louder," she said. "Every year a little louder. Last month I started being able to hear actual words. He's saying he's falling." I broke protocol that evening. At 6:30 p.m., after Rebecca left, I called Thomas Bradford, Robert's former supervisor, the man who'd been in charge of safety at the accident site. I'd always suspected something was wrong about that accident. The machinery had failed in a way that shouldn't have been possible if proper maintenance had been done, but the investigation had cleared Thomas and the company. I asked him if he'd been hearing anything strange. There was a long silence, then he hung up. He called back 20 minutes later from a different number and asked me to meet him at a diner off Route 9. Thomas looked like he'd aged 30 years instead of 15. He sat across from me at 8:15 p.m., hands shaking around a coffee cup, and told me he'd sabotaged the safety equipment. Not intentionally, he'd been cutting costs, delaying maintenance, falsifying inspection reports. The accident was his fault. And ever since Robert died, he'd been hearing screaming, not just at home, everywhere. In his car, at work, in restaurants, a constant low vibration that made his teeth ache, that made him feel like he was standing on the edge of an infinite drop. "It's getting stronger," he said. "Every year, and I swear to God, Alan, sometimes I can feel myself falling. Just for a second, I lose connection with the ground, and there's nothing below me. Nothing at all." Claire Holland contacted me the next morning. I don't know how she found out about the skull. Maybe Philip mentioned it to someone. Maybe word just travels in weird circles. But she showed up at the morgue at 9 a.m. claiming to be a paranormal acoustics specialist. I was skeptical until she showed me her credentials. She'd published papers on EVP phenomena, on sound as a carrier of consciousness, on dimensional frequencies. She asked to see the skull, and I let her because by that point I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. She set up her recording equipment at 10:30 a.m., spent 2 hours analyzing the frequencies, and finally told me what she thought was happening. Robert's consciousness had become trapped in the moment of death. The trauma had been so severe, the transition so violent, that part of him had gotten stuck, experiencing an eternal fall into whatever comes after. The skull was functioning as a resonance chamber, amplifying his perpetual scream across dimensional boundaries. "He's still falling," she said. "He's been falling for 15 years and he's finally getting close to something. The frequencies are intensifying because he's approaching whatever's at the bottom." That night, the glass started shattering. At 11:47 p.m., alone in the morgue, I heard the first crack, a beaker on the counter, spontaneously fracturing. Then a window. Then the glass front of a specimen cabinet. Each break corresponded with a spike in the subsonic frequencies emanating from Robert's skull. The screaming was getting loud enough to have physical effects. I tried to sleep at my desk, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I was falling. Not dreaming about falling, actually falling, through absolute darkness, with no sense of direction or speed or anything solid anywhere. I'd jerk awake gasping, hands gripping the desk, and the sensation would fade but never quite disappear. I could still feel it, like the ground beneath me had become uncertain. By Friday morning, I knew I had to make a decision. I could authorize cremation, end Robert's scream, silence whatever had been trapped in that skull for 15 years. Or I could preserve it, document it, provide scientific proof that consciousness persists beyond brain death. Philip wanted to study it further. Claire thought destroying it would trap Robert in his fall forever. Rebecca just wanted the screaming to stop. I chose cremation, scheduled it for 2 p.m. that Friday. I told myself it was the right thing, the merciful thing. But standing in the crematory, watching the skull slide into the retort, I saw something that made me stop the process. The jaw moved, closed, then opened again, wider than anatomically possible, and for just a second the subsonic vibration became audible, an actual scream, high and desperate and full of terror. I shut down the crematory. I don't know why. Maybe because I realized Rebecca had lived with that scream for 15 years, and I'd only been hearing it for 3 days. Maybe because I understood that some screams don't get to end just because we can't bear to hear them. The skull is still in the morgue. It's been 5 days now, and the frequencies are still intensifying. Glass breaks every night. I've stopped trying to sleep because the falling sensation doesn't stop anymore. It's constant, like I'm standing on ground that's perpetually giving way. Philip says the frequencies will eventually reach a threshold that could cause structural damage. Claire says Robert is almost at the bottom of his fall, and when he hits, the dimensional barrier might break. I don't know what I'm waiting for. Maybe I just want to hear what happens when he finally stops falling. Maybe I need to know if there's a bottom, or if he'll just keep screaming forever in the dark. Last night, I dreamed I was Robert, pinned under machinery, screaming about falling. But in the dream, I realized I wasn't pinned at all. I was standing upright, and the ground beneath me was an infinite chasm, and I'd been falling all along without knowing it. When I woke up, my office floor had a crack in it, a thin fissure running from my desk to the door, like something had tried to open beneath me. If you're reading this, maybe I sent it to someone, or maybe they found it after I'm gone. Either way, don't work with the dead if you can help it. And if you ever hear a sound so low, you can only feel it. If you ever sense a vibration that makes the ground feel uncertain, step away. Don't try to understand it. Don't try to help. Because Robert Kimball has been falling for 15 years, and every second of his scream has been building, accumulating, growing louder. And I think I finally understand what he's falling toward. It's us, all of us, the ground we're standing on. And the distance to the bottom is getting shorter every day.